well. So should we start, Heidi? What do you think?
Yeah, let's make a start. I've just hit record, so we're ready.
All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the 4th International Development and Innovation Seminars of 2021. My name is Lorena Lombardozzi. I'm a lecturer in economics here at the Open University, and today we are really happy to welcome, actually we're just talking about it, a new, relatively new hire at the Open University in the business school, Jamie Woodcock, who's a senior lecturer in management, and he's a researcher also based in London. He's the author of The Gig Economy, published with Polity in 2019, Marx at the Arcade with Haymarket in 2019, and Working in the Phones, published with Pluto in 2017. His research is inspired by workers' inquiry and focuses on labor, work, the gig economy, platforms, resistance, organizing, and video games. He's on the editorial boards of Notes from Below and Historical Materialism. And we just learned that Jamie published recently an open access book that we can download for free, and we will maybe share the link in the chat box, titled The Fight Against Platform Capitalism, an inquiry into the global struggles of the gig economy. So thank you, Jamie, for accepting our invitation, and we are really happy to hear your new research. I guess the paper you will present is inspired by your latest book. But the title of the of this presentation is, wait, I don't remember, but yeah, Digital Workerism, Tracing Global Worker Struggles Against Platforms. So super happy to have you here. Just a few housekeeping rules. We have muted all the participants, but in the Q&A, you just raise your hands and Heidi will kindly unmute. You are also, the video is being recorded and will be available for playback. So people who don't want to be featured can ask questions in the Q&A chat box and ask to remain anonymous. Also, please follow us on Twitter at the handle intdev_OU. And Heidi put it in the chat box. Thank you, Heidi. So without further ado, let's start. Thank you, Jamie, and yeah, floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the very kind introduction. It's a real pleasure. I was going to say to come and speak at OU. I mean, I'm at the OU, but you know, obviously none of us are physically at the OU. But it's really lovely to come and talk about some of my research. What I want to talk about today is a kind of long-running project, which started in 2016 or thereabout. But during the lockdown, I wrote up some of the ideas and some of the themes and some of the research into a book, as Lorena said. So I'm really going to speak to some of the parts from this book, and you can read the book for free. You can download the PDF. So I'll kind of talk around some of the ideas from that. But in the next kind of half an hour or so, I want to tell you about where the ideas from the book came from, and some of the arguments that I've tried to make about the shape of the gig economy and what's really been happening in the gig economy over the last 5 years or so. And what I'm really going to focus on is about the struggles of platform workers. So the kinds of work that over the past 5 or so years are becoming increasingly mediated through smartphones and through digital platforms of various kinds. Some of this is going to be about passenger transport driving, so platforms like Uber or Bolt. Some of it's going to be about food delivery, so platforms like Deliveroo, and some of it's going to be about online work, so things like Amazon Mechanical Turk, or Upwork, these kinds of platforms. But for me, my interest in this really began in 2016, so around 5 years ago. I had a student at the time who told me that he'd started working for Deliveroo. And in one of these ways that, these things often work out like this, I'd never heard of Deliveroo before. And the moment he told me that he was working for Deliveroo, I started to see riders all over the city, all over London. So I started to see people with the Deliveroo jackets, waiting at traffic lights or waiting outside restaurants. And what I found interesting about this is quite soon after these started to become a sight in the city, people started to make arguments that these were workers that couldn't organize, or that something new was happening with this work that had undermined the ability for people to get better contracts or to fight for improved conditions. And I have a real interest in unorganizable work, or work that other people have kind of written off. And although it's now less common to hear these arguments, at the time people said things like, these workers don't share a workplace, so how would they even meet each other? Or there's a big turnover in staff, so why would people stay and fight for better conditions? And so some people blame the precariousness of the work. Some people blamed it on young people doing the work, that somehow the nature of the work had changed, that technology had somehow disrupted people's potential to have better conditions at work, or a combination of these things. And I had recently finished a project about call centers, and I saw lots of similarities in how people were talking about Deliveroo work from call centers, that this was new work and it couldn't be organized. And I even remember having a conversation with a senior union organizer who told me, these workers won't be able to organize or join unions because we simply can't find them. And I remember joking with him at the time that we could have a delivery rider here in 5 minutes. We could have two here in 10 minutes, that we could order some food to the union office. And he said, no, this just won't work. And what I want to say in this talk is not to kind of say that those criticisms were wrong, or that people had missed out on this, but that this wouldn't be the first time that we would hear arguments that these workers couldn't organize. It wouldn't be the last time we would hear them, but that in fact, as things unraveled in the next couple of years, there would be many strikes of delivery riders. There would be many new networks of workers form. There would be many contacts, both on a national level and international. And I wanted to try and unpick how this happened, because I think in a way, what's so interesting about platform work is not that it's so difficult to organize, but actually how quickly the organizing has happened. So in such a short space of time, so much has happened. And that's really the problem that I've tried to understand, in this talk and in the book, I guess. And so I want to start off with a couple of small examples to illustrate some themes that I think are useful here. Throughout my research, I've always found, when interviewing platform workers, so I spent the last 5 years or so doing research with platform workers in London, but I've also spent some time in Bangalore in India doing field work, in Cape Town and Johannesburg in the US, in Canada, a few other places, talking to gig workers. And the thing that I've always found is that workers are already in networks. These are not isolated workers, whether they're doing food delivery or transport work. They're often already in WhatsApp groups. They're already networked. They're already talking to each other. And that just because they don't share a workplace doesn't mean they don't have points of communication and points of contact where they talk to each other. Outside the restaurant becomes like the water cooler in an office workplace, where people share stories and talk about things and share ideas or ways to start organizing at work. And so I want to start with a paraphrase of Ep Thompson, which of course Ep Thompson wasn't writing about platform workers, but he uses this phrase that the working class was present at its own making, at its own birth. And the argument I want to make is that platform workers too were present at their own making, that platform workers have a history before they sign up to work on platforms, that they bring their experiences of other kinds of work, of organizing in other sectors, of existing social networks, of politics, of what they want from the work, and bring these onto platforms. And so what we find is not that these are blank slates where people are organizing from nothing, but people bring their own networks and experiences into this work. And so I want to draw attention to three, I think I'll call them moments of solidarity, or kind of moments of illustrating some of the dynamics in platform work. And I'm going to give some examples and talk through these because I think they really help us to make sense of platform work. The first is that there is increasing connection between platform workers. That the evidence overwhelmingly shows that platform workers are not isolated individuals, but form connections through the work. The second is that there is a kind of structural lack of communication from platforms to people that work on platforms. So there's very little negotiation from platforms to workers. And what I'm going to argue is that this actually leads to increased worker resistance and increased escalation of organizing, because most platforms refuse to talk to workers about terms and conditions. And the third is that the growth of these platforms, the scale of them, has laid a new basis for solidarity with increasingly large numbers of workers, both in individual cities, in countries, and increasingly internationally. And the point that I want to make about these is that they're not accidental, that they come from how the work is technically organized. So the use of technology has created these new moments where workers can come together and can begin organizing. The first example that I want to give is with this student in 2016 in London, who said to me, we should go and talk to some delivery riders. And so we spent a part of that summer in 2016 wandering around central London and talking to delivery riders. There's a particular route that I remember quite well along the river, past Borough Market, where you can, in a short space of time, go through loads and loads of different meeting points of delivery riders, because there are lots and lots of restaurants in this neighborhood. And we would go and talk to people, and they would say, they would tell us their experience of the work. They would show us WhatsApp groups that they'd already formed. They would tell us where their favorite meeting points were, whether you could shelter from the rain, where you could use a bathroom, all the different things that people need while they're kind of waiting for work. And what we found is that there were already these overlapping networks across the whole city. And this student of mine was very interested in seeing if people would want to join a union or go on strike. And what we found was that these discussions were already happening before he joined. And quite quickly, it became clear that even if there wasn't a union, there was an effective level of organization that was already being built. Deliveroo decided to change the payment scheme. So these workers were originally paid an hourly rate and then a bonus for every delivery, and they were moved on to just paid for delivery. And the response from many workers was that they wanted to go on strike. They didn't want these changes to happen. And so across these WhatsApp groups that we've been added to, we saw very quickly people talking about having a strike, talking about what demands they would make. And in the summer of 2016, the first strike of food delivery workers happened in London, and it lasted 5 days or so, and showed that these WhatsApp networks could be used effectively to organize a strike. And this, for me, was a real evidence that these weren't isolated workers, that they had already built connections. And from that moment on, I think some of these experiences have been shared more widely across the gig economy. And I want to give an example of this lack of communication and how I think this builds off the connections that workers make between each other. So this second dynamic, this lack of communication, I came across an example of this when I was doing fieldwork in Bangalore. So Bangalore, if people are not familiar with the city, is a large city in the south of India. It has very bad traffic and it has fantastic takeaway food that lots of people order throughout the city. So there's a very wide network of delivery drivers and it's quite a common service. They don't have Deliveroo, but they have essentially an identical set of companies, one called Swiggy and one called Zomato. And we spent some time doing something similar to what I did on the South Bank in London, which was wandering around Bangalore, talking to drivers about their conditions, about what they thought about the work. I worked with two fantastic master's students in Bangalore. There are maybe 6 commonly spoken languages in Bangalore. I only speak English, so I needed quite a lot of help to have these encounters. But we would go and we would talk to people about their conditions and about what was happening. And one of the things we would do is type Swiggy or Zomato into Google, and then their offices would appear because the drivers have to know how to get to them. These are not publicly listed anywhere, but you can find them through Google Maps because this is how drivers find their way to these places. And we would go to these meeting points and we would talk to people. And one of the things that I found really interesting was how little communication the drivers had from the platforms themselves. Much like in London, they would change the model. They would say, we're going to pay you half as much for each drop, and there's nothing you can do about it. And we had heard no evidence that there were strikes or that there was organising in Bangalore, but we met a group of workers who had organised, I think, their 3rd strike, something like this. The last one had 400 workers involved, and they'd forced a change in the delivery platforms model. And what some of them told us is, they wanted to be able to negotiate. They wanted to be able to talk about the changes that were happening, but they just received a message saying, we're going to reduce your pay, or we're going to change something around. And so what they said is the only option we have to negotiate is to go on strike. And I think this is something that we see quite commonly, whether in Bangalore, in London, or elsewhere, is in lots of traditional forms of work. If you have a problem with something that happens at work, there's often a supervisor or a manager who will help to negotiate that problem. We'll say, I know you have to work Sundays, but we'll give you a better rota deal in 2 weeks' time, or something like this. Or we're going to cut your pay here, but we'll do something else to improve things elsewhere. This doesn't happen in platform work. Is people are not given the opportunity to negotiate the smaller issues, and so grievances build and build. And so often the first thing that happens is a strike is called. And I think this is quite an important issue, and is one to try and understand with platform work. Is the reason platforms don't want to negotiate is a fear of being seen that they're an employer. So by not negotiating, they can continue to claim that people who work for them are self-employed. And I think we see this with Uber in London, right? The recent Supreme Court case, which has finally decided the issue that the Uber drivers are not self-employed, that they are worker status, is a lot of the behaviors of platforms are wrapped up in trying to continue this fiction of the drivers as self-employed, as their own business. And so for platforms, a lot of what this means is not communicating effectively. So not sharing training materials, not telling people how to do the work, not negotiating with them on terms and conditions. So they look less like an employer. And what this means is, in many cases, if workers have a problem, they find other workers to talk to about it. Other workers help people to negotiate the problems with the work, to find the solutions or the tips and tricks to get by. And so the lack of communication has provided a kind of a fertile ground for workers to develop those networks amongst each other. Because often when we start work, what we want to do is to find someone with a similar experience to us and share what we think about the work, maybe to share our complaints about it, or to talk about what we would want to do differently, or to moan about one thing or another. And so I think that lack of communication has really facilitated worker-to-worker communication on platforms. The third example that I want to talk about is about the increasingly shared conditions, not just within a city, not just within a country, but also internationally. Is one of the things we asked delivery riders in Bangalore is what were your key demands? What would you like to change about the work? And often what people would say is we want to change the pay. These are the three top issues. And then we would like more safety. We don't want to be deactivated with no way to appeal this. And we want to have contact with a human manager that we can complain to, or whatever. And this is a very, very similar set of demands to riders in London, that the top three complaints are the pay, but then also issues around road safety, around these other things. And I think it's not the case that there haven't been shared conditions of work internationally. I also do research with cleaners in the UK, and cleaning work is similar in the UK to France, which is similar to the US, similar to many countries. But there isn't so much of an identification of those shared conditions between security guards or cleaners or other precarious forms of work. But the third example that I want to give is an example of, and this does feel like a very distant experience, of getting off a plane in South Africa and getting in the back of a cab into the city. It's quite a long flight to South Africa. And so I would always say to myself, I'm feeling really jet lagged, but I really want to talk to the driver in the car and find out, what's been happening with Uber and Bolt drivers since I've last been there. So I remember once getting in the back of this car and talking to someone. And cab drivers in Cape Town are very chatty. So we were speaking about all sorts of things on the way in. Talk about how pay has been declining, or what the latest changes are from Uber in Cape Town. And then the driver turned to me and he said, what's it like being an Uber driver in East London? And so I told him a bit about the experiences of drivers I'd met in London. And he asked, what kind of cars do people drive? Very different cars in South Africa. No one drives a Toyota Prius in South Africa. If you're an Uber driver, there's a very particular set of cars people have. So having that kind of general discussion about details of the work. And then he said, I've heard about the protests. Can you tell me a bit more about the protests that have happened? Can you tell me about the court cases? And so we had this kind of long conversation about, sharing experiences of these things. And then when I got out of the cab, I thought to myself, that's actually quite a strange experience if you think about it. 10 years ago, if I'd gone to Cape Town, he wouldn't have asked me what it was like to be a mini cab driver in East London. He wouldn't have wanted to be put in touch with mini cab drivers. He wouldn't have seen a shared employer internationally, that he had a reason to speak to drivers on the other side of the world to talk about their terms and conditions. And so the argument that I want to make about the gig economy and about platform work is about these three examples and the dynamics that they involve. Because I think each of these shows new tendencies that emerge with platform work. The first shows how connected these workers are. That despite the surface appearance of isolated work, digital communication brings these workers together. Of course, face-to-face too, of meeting outside restaurants or airports or whatever it is. But drivers have to use a smartphone to do this kind of work. So it means in between jobs, you're sat with a smartphone, talking to people, communicating with people. So technology has brought people together in important ways. The second example shows the lack of communication from the platform. The failure of the platform to provide information, which in a sense isn't a failure so much as a deliberate choice, a decision to try and not look like an employer and to withhold information, to not mediate grievances, which leads to escalating forms of worker action. And so what's surprising in a way is that the dominant mode of worker action in the gig economy has become wildcat strike action. Sometimes very large strikes, sometimes quite frequent strikes, and increasingly strikes that are coordinated across national borders. So Callum Cant, who's written a fantastic book on Deliveroo that people should definitely read if you're interested, also did a study about how the strike in London was quite quickly copied by workers in France, in Italy and elsewhere, sharing tactics and strategies through social media and beginning to coordinate strikes across Europe. And in a sense, that is a huge development to happen in only a couple of years of this work existing, that workers are finding new ways to coordinate across national boundaries. And so the third example is this illustration of the global features of this work. The international platforms have, in a sense, laid the basis for a new kind of transnational solidarity. That if companies like Uber really did employ people, they would be some of the biggest employers in the world that bring together workforces across continents, across different countries. And taken together, I think these three dynamics show us that clearly gig workers are not unorganizable, but that in fact they're beginning to take part in increasingly global struggles against platforms and against how work is being organized today. And that each of these different aspects are driven by what I would call the technical composition of the work. So how capital has chosen to organize the workplace, or in this case, the distributed workplace, but that also they're shaped by how platform workers are composed outside of the work, so particularly through migration. So many platforms rely on migrant labor. So in London, to give you an example, many Deliveroo riders are Brazilian migrants. And this community is very well networked. Lots of workers are in touch with each other already. They bring each other into the work. And then those networks become an important part of organizing on those platforms. And I think this is also underpinned by two key features of the work. And the first, I hope now, is not so controversial, which is to say that platform work is indeed work. It's not some kind of flexible self-employment, but is work that platforms exert managerial control over and then profit from exploiting workers who are delivering the food or moving people from one place to another. And so while many platforms still claim not to be employers, the labor process involves control, it involves surveillance, but these don't represent some kind of break from how work has been organized previously, that we can still understand this as a work relationship. And that platforms limit their appearance as employers actually just results in a sharpening of the contradictions of the labor process. It makes the work more likely to be organized by workers rather than less likely to be organized by some kind of self-employed workers. The minimizing of training, the reducing of support, the refusal to provide equipment, the deactivations, lack of negotiation, all of these things mean workers have fewer institutional channels through which they can raise issues or have them resolved. And so many workers increasingly turn to wildcat strike action to raise their grievances. And I think what's interesting about this is if we think of previous forms of work, car manufacturing, for example, when it first appears, or dock work, often these took generations of, or if not generations, a generation of workers going through this work, understanding this work, testing out tactics and strategies to arrive at forms through which they could effectively organize for better conditions. We've seen this happen in a matter of 4 or 5 years in platform work, which, if anything, is kind of remarkable how quickly this has happened, not that it's happened at all. And the second feature that I want to kind of connect to this is that because platform workers are workers, we also need to have a think about what it is that platform workers want from platform work. Is I think too often we can see Uber, if you'll excuse the pun, as the driving force of the gig economy, right? That they have disrupted everything. But I think we also need to see that many workers are rejecting traditional forms of work, rejecting, work with traditional employment contracts because they're searching for greater flexibility in their work. And to give you an example of this, one of the delivery riders that I've interviewed a number of times always used to say to me, I like to work for Deliveroo because the alternative is working in a call center or a cafe or a bar. And if I work there, I have a manager who stands behind me and tells me I have to smile, tells me I have to look like I'm enjoying the work, tells me I have to work harder or faster. And I prefer working for Deliveroo because I just get an email that tells me what work to do. Is a kind of hatred of some of the other forms of work that people have to do is an important push factor for people trying to find more flexible ways to make a living. Is in a sense, Uber and Deliveroo and these sorts of platforms, whilst in the global north, represent a deterioration of existing working conditions. And we can say in the global south, broadly speaking, many people are moving out of informal work into this kind of work. We end up with a very similar form of precarious work. For some, is about finding employment opportunities that they couldn't otherwise find. Whereas for others, it may be trying to reject forms of employment that people don't want to do, essentially. And so what we need to think about is that flexibility isn't something you have to bargain away employment rights in order to get. And I make this argument a number of times in the book, and I kind of feel that the Supreme Court ruling has settled this in many ways, that you can have flexible work and still be paid the minimum wage and have holiday and sick pay and so on. So I'm not going to kind of spend too long on that one. But what I also want to say, and I think I will finish on this, is to say that what I think is important, and I think from a research perspective, as well as from an organizing perspective, is I've spent a lot of time with different worker organizations that are trying to experiment with what unions look like in the gig economy. And in particular, the one that I've spent most time with is the IWGB, which is a trade union in the UK. And I think there are some very powerful examples that we can take from the gig economy that matter much, much more widely than just for delivery riders or just for Uber drivers. Is if the Uber model or the delivery model becomes successful, companies won't just use this for food delivery or for passenger transport. Is the successes of these changes in the Ubers and the Deliveroos of this world will come to other kinds of work. You could see that there might be a powerful argument for changing parts of the NHS, for meeting demand in one way or another, or even higher education, that you have people come in on shorter contracts or whatever it is. And the founder of Uber now runs, well, a number of things, but one of them is a broader temporary staffing agency version of Uber that is pitched for security, for hospitality work, for care work, and so on. So what happens in the gig economy matters, because if a successful model of changing responsibility of work and how much people are paid and so on works in these sectors, it will happen elsewhere. And so I often think when we talk about the future of work, we shouldn't imagine this point on the horizon where maybe robots come, maybe they don't, maybe self-driving cars come, maybe they don't. But we should think about these moments like the Supreme Court, like the strike of a delivery workers in London, like the campaigns of Bolt and Uber drivers in South Africa. Is these are moments where the future of work is being decided. Will it be a fairer future of work that works for people who are delivering these services, or will it be a future of work that delivers for shareholders and investment capital? And so I think these stories are important, not only to see workers finding new agency and new ways to do things, but also for what they can teach the wider labour movement. That if you can organise with Deliveroo couriers, many of them migrant workers, many of them on very precarious contracts, that there is the potential to rethink how we organise in workplaces like universities, like healthcare, like manufacturing, and to try and take these lessons and to see that worker organising is not a thing of the past, but is something that very exciting changes are happening. And so I want to end on the Ep Thompson butchering of the quote that I used at the beginning, which is that if platform workers were present at their own making, they're present now to leading the campaigns and the struggles against these platforms, and that their struggles will shape the future beyond platforms too. And that's what we should be paying attention to. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jamie, for these fascinating and deep reflections on what we are living now. And I mean, I think I completely agree with you that we look at the gig economy as a fringe sometimes, but actually has a huge implication for what's the context, both in terms of regulations, institutions, technology, and I mean, like relations of labor. And innovation, which is the title of our series, and we have a lot of people specializing in innovations across the participants. But I can see, we become quite a few. So without further ado, because I have a lot of questions, but maybe I will save it at the end. I will open the floor for the participants, and please raise your hands or write in the chat box. I will read the first one from Les. Les is a research fellow at DPP and works on the peasants' questions in Latin America, and especially. And yes, for a platform to facilitate capitalist exploitation, it must make labor and workers interchangeable. How is this done with Deliveroo and possibly extended to other sectors?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I mean, I think if I understand your question correctly, so my understanding is that Deliveroo as a platform likes to claim that what it is doing is just to put customers in touch with restaurants and delivery riders and just kind of facilitate those actors coming together. But my understanding of what Deliveroo does is purchase labor power from delivery riders. Now, one of the interesting things about this, and I think is one of the points that I think is quite a useful debate, is what the platform model allows. There is an attempt to purchase labor power, but not to pay for the means of the subsistence of that labor power. So, for example, the delivery rider has to pay for their own bicycle, their own smartphone, their own data package to be able to use the service and so on. And so I think really what we see with the facilitating of their of exploitation on the platform is that many of the things that companies used to have to pay for when they're buying labor power that comes attached to workers is a whole series of other protections and things for them to complete the task. And so instead, these platforms try to force things that previously wouldn't be the worker's responsibility onto the worker to pay. And I think, this shows that, the secret of the profit making of these platforms is that they charge the consumer more than they pay the delivery worker. And this is a long running trick of capitalism, right? But yeah, I don't know if that answers it specifically enough for you, Les.
Hi, Les. Do you want to follow up? Maybe Heidi, do you want to unmute Les? Maybe that's also the issue. Les?
Oh, here.
Here, yeah. Thanks.
Yes, certainly. The providing nothing to the laborers, what might have been called fixed capital in conventional work settings, then simplifies the operation for the exploiter, and perhaps also helps to make the tasks more interchangeable. I mean, that's a question in my mind from the concept abstract labor and the potential for this model to be extended to other types of labor or other economic sectors.
Yeah, I think I have something to add to this. I mean, I think it's a really important question because I think there is a pressure towards homogenizing the labor involved, right? That anybody could log on to these platforms and deliver food or whatever it is. The reality is that delivery work is not straightforward or simple. Much like driving is not straightforward or simple. And I think there's an attempt to make it appear as if this work is that labor and workers have become interchangeable here. And so the example that I'll give for this is Deliveroo often talk about cyclists in their promotional material. There's a lot made out of this being a eco-friendly, you're having somebody cycle your food around or so on. The reality is that cyclists have never done much of the work. They take on peak demand over meal times. They take on a part of the work. The majority of the work is completed by moped drivers because they can carry more food, because they have a larger box on the back. And they often work much longer hours because they're much more likely to be more proletarianized migrant workers, Brazilian migrants in London particularly, or Eastern European migrants. And so the reality is that there are very different kinds of workers that work on these platforms. So being able to stack orders and work very long hours is not something that, if I were to log on and do one shift, I would not be able to perform anywhere near the same way that workers with that level of skill and experience of navigating the city are. But I think it's easier for the platform, right, to appear as if, anybody can log on and do this work.
Yeah, it's very interesting how this narrative of being unskilled is like the care industry is very similar. We have Alan, senior lecturer in economics. He also works on technology and stuff, many other things. For some minicab drivers who are already self-employed with self-bought equipment, Uber has become a complementary source of business, a piece of software that brings in more trade. Does that set them against the Uber workers who don't also run their own business alongside the Uber work? That's an interesting... do you want to, or should I read a couple of them?
A couple.
Okay, so Sarah, who's a PhD candidate in sociology, social policy and criminology, has very interesting talk. The areas of platform work you talk about are male-dominated areas of work. Could you say more about why this is? Do women platform work? And then Sheena, the platforms mentioned appear to be male majority workers, so along this line of Sarah. Are these examples where a platform has more women workers, and have they been as willing to organize?
Yeah, so these are great questions. I mean, I think the first thing to say for Alan's question is I think this differs, and one of the points that I'm always very keen to make about gig work is that despite its appearances of internationalization and homogenizing everything across the world, there are still really important national differences that come out in the way that gig work is formed and develops and so on. And in particular, transport work has lots of regulations that shift things in different national contexts. So in the UK, for example, we have a historic and long-running division between black cabs and minicabs. This is a racialized distinction, with the majority of black cab drivers being white British and the majority of minicab drivers being black and minority ethnic. And you have similar kinds of things like in South Africa, for example, taxis has a very different meaning and refers to minibuses that run set routes and people pay for them. And Uber is often seen as disrupting that. There are often examples of violence between taxi and Uber drivers. So I think we do need to try and draw out some of those differences, because I think for some transport workers, this is experienced as a threat to their livelihoods. So if you're a medallion driver in New York City, for example, and it may be in some cases that this is pushing people out of work or undermining their ability to make a living. And then for other groups of workers, it can be an entry into a kind of work that they weren't able to have entry into before. So I think it's often not so straightforward that Uber arrives with nothing there before. For some people, this is a huge benefit to be able to work for them. For others, many cab firms have been destroyed by Uber, and so people have moved over wholesale. So yes, you're right that we do need to think about how these can often be an additional way for some people to make money. One word of warning is a lot of the literature talks about the US, where there are many more part-time Uber drivers. In the UK, this is much less common. So most Uber drivers work full-time. And this is mainly because of the vehicle requirements. So you have to have a very specific kind of car in the UK to work for Uber. Many people take this on finance, and you then have to work full time. In the US, the restrictions are much less. So if you have a car, you can often do a few hours of Uber here and there. So this is often a kind of a difference in regulation, which I think is important to draw attention to, right? Because it shows that these platforms can be regulated, that they're not unregulatable. The next two questions I think are really important. Delivery work is overwhelmingly male, as is transport work. I have done a few interviews with people, with women who work in the sector, but they are very much the tiny minority. In online work, which I didn't get so much time to talk about, but there's more about in the book, there is less of a kind of majority male workforce. So on Amazon Mechanical Turk, for example, it's not gendered in the same way. The example that I think is important to give for this, and I would love to talk more about it, but I haven't done the research to be able to do so, is the majority of gig workers in the world are women, and the majority of gig workers are in care, but it's much harder to do this research. Care platforms are much harder to access than transport workers. To do research with Uber or Deliveroo, you can walk out onto the street and talk to people. With work that happens in people's homes, it's much harder to gain access. So because of the gendering of this work historically, it's harder to gain access to it, right? I have spent some time interviewing domestic workers in South Africa who work for a domestic work platform. They haven't organized strikes. But my word of warning on this is there's a risk of saying that this work, maybe there's a reason it can't be organized or whatever, which would be the same thing that people said about transport work early on, is I'm sure that these platforms are alive with resistance, that people are organizing, that they have networks. I just think it's not broken above the surface. And if somebody's looking for a PhD project, or a research project, gig work care platforms are definitely something that needs urgent attention. But I don't have anything to say about it, unfortunately, other than it should be looked at.
Thank you, Jamie. We have another round of questions. Is that okay? Then, we have Jose Febrero, is a PhD candidate in the business school, and he's from Brazil, and asks, regarding Deliveroo and Uber Eats in the UK, in your research in London regarding to the Brazilian, have you come across the issue of illegal immigrant and exploitation of these by middlemen who are the ones who possess the registered accounts with the apps? Sarah confirms that in her area, May Uber drivers also my local taxi company, they do both. And then we have West Josephine, how would you locate the experience of Amazon warehouse workers within platform work? They are often working on insecure 0 hours contract, but have direct contact with managers. Can their experience of digital labor and resistance be compared to the gig economy workers? And then Nicola Eats, who's a professor in social policy here at OU, asks, what is the age profile of platform workers? I don't know if Nicola wants to specify which one. And then, do you want to answer those?
Yeah, let's do those. I'll do those quickly, and then so the issue with Brazilian workers in London. So this is something I'm always very cautious to talk about, because I think there's a politics of the kinds of knowledge that we're generating, right? And to give you one example of this, when I would interview delivery riders, they would often tell me about the tips and tricks they developed to get paid when they weren't working, or food for free, or these kinds of ways that people make the work a bit better for them. And I would always say, look, I'm not going to publish this, because if I do, you won't be able to do it anymore. And so I think we should always think about that question of what is the risk of what we find out and what we share. And I think particularly around irregular migration status and around people using other people's accounts, these are complicated issues. And there is often a lot of exploitation, as you say, from middlemen who use these sorts of things. But I think the argument we need to make is, we have to make an argument about people having access to work, and not about the which is, I know, not what you're saying, but about there is a kind of risk that a right-wing narrative says, you're having people who aren't registered properly delivering food, and these are dangerous things to happen, and so on. So I'm always a bit cautious to talk about this. But, in the Brazilian community, there are long-running issues relating to some of these things. But what I think is particularly interesting at the moment is I do some research with some Brazilian colleagues in Brazil, and we've put riders in the UK in contact with riders in Sao Paulo who are on strike, and had these wonderful Zoom calls where people shared their experiences of being delivery riders in different countries. So I think as academics, we should also think about what we can do with our networks to put people in touch and facilitate things, which I think is kind of useful. I see that you've raised a hand, so maybe you want to respond.
No, I completely agree with you, and I'm really happy to hear you have this perspective as well. Yeah, but the point, the reason why I wanted to raise this point is because this will have a lot of effect on the ability of workers to organize and have strikes and so on. So this is something that may be on the background on the different patterns that will be observed here in the developed world relative to places like South Africa, Brazil, or India. So that's just wanted to put this more into context. I didn't follow up with the explanation with the context of my question. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really important point, and I've with these Brazilian colleagues, have been trying to work out a kind of there are ways that workers who might be using other accounts or having other ways of doing things still have particular norms around the work, and things that they will do and won't do. So we're writing a paper about how, particularly in the Brazilian community, people try to prevent individual workers doing something that undermines everybody collectively. So things that involve a race to the bottom. And from those moments of solidarity where people say you should work in this way because if you do it that way you hurt other workers, it begins to lay the basis for other collective forms of action. And I think it's certainly not the case that the strike is the only way that people do these things. And I think the ways that migrant communities self-organize, particularly in the context of xenophobia in England, means that it's not just the strike that is something that these migrant workers will engage with as part of building a collective identity. So Sarah asks, in your area, your Uber driver was also your local taxi company. Yeah, so lots of people do both, and in London, when I say Uber driver, I often mean somebody who does Uber, and then when the deals are better, they work for Bolt. What's interesting is that somebody who works for multiple apps still calls himself an Uber driver. There is a kind of identity of the Uber driver, right? I think it's also worth saying, and I mean this not in a way that is London-centric, because I don't know necessarily what you're talking about, but London is strategically important globally for companies like Uber and Deliveroo, like New York is, like San Francisco is, like Sao Paulo is. These are really the places where huge amounts of money are made for these platforms. There's a kind of interesting question of whether Deliveroo is sustainable outside of London, perhaps Manchester, perhaps Birmingham, but it has now expanded into many, many small towns, which there's an argument about whether it's a sustainable, whether they can actually have a business model that sustains it. And I think that's something that will be interesting to see unravel in the next few years.
Yeah, then Josephine asked about what is the specificity of the Amazon warehouse workers within the platform work with regard to contact with managers.
Yeah, so I think this is another good question. And I think it's also worth remembering that Amazon have a very large fleet of delivery riders in addition to warehouse workers. And if people have been following the union drive in Alabama in the US to unionize an Amazon logistics warehouse, there's some really interesting things happening, because at the same time as this, drivers are being forced to sign new contracts in the US, to have monitored when their seatbelt is on, whether they yawn while they're driving, to have kind of huge levels of surveillance put in there. So in that sense, there's a lot of similarity with delivery drivers. But for warehouse workers specifically, I think, this is an infrastructural shift in how the economy is being organized. And I think there is a huge effort to prevent organizing of Amazon warehouse workers. You can actually go and visit an Amazon warehouse. And if you get a chance, you should go and do it, because you see that these have been designed to prevent workers organizing in lots of ways. Not having people work near each other, not having like places to meet up and talk, a whole series of strategies to undermine workers organizing, which when I see these things, what I think is an organization is terrified, because if workers did organize, they'd have a lot of power. So I think there are definitely similarities, particularly with electronic surveillance and algorithmic management and so on. The Amazon warehouse worker is not a totally distinct kind of worker from the food delivery worker or so on. So I think there are some comparisons, but they do have a physical workplace, and they also have huge disruptive potential as choke points in the economy. The age profile is a difficult one to talk about because it varies depending on what platform we're talking about. To give you an example, Deliveroo riders in London tend to be younger than Uber drivers, although there's an increasing layer of older workers moving on to Deliveroo through the COVID pandemic. And Uber drivers skew to an older demographic in parts of London, 40s, 50s. But again, it's difficult to say overall what the profile is, because there's quite a diverse workforce across both the UK and then internationally as well.
Yes, then we have a question from Nishant Benwal. Thank you for the talk. What are your views in respect to Global South, only to India, where anyway the majoritarian employment is unorganized sector with little or no production under labor law, where such platforms are actually preferred for reasons such as money directly in the bank and timely wage distribution and a new source of employment. Also, I observed that compared to traditional unorganized sector, workers seem to have a sense of belonging as exhibited by uniforms as being part of a larger enterprise. And I confirm that in other contexts. And a comment from Theo, who is a professor of innovation and politics at DPP. What matters, I think, is to look at whether this innovative platform exacerbated or improved the essence of relations between labor and capital, beyond claims about flexibility. And Nicola, thanks you. So if you want to follow up on these questions, guys, just raise your hands and Heidi will unmute. But yeah, in the meantime, maybe you can reply to these two questions / comments.
Yeah, so I think the question of the Global South is a really important one here, because there is a risk that, we talk about the majority of the research is in the UK, in the US, in some parts of Europe on this kind of work. And often this is talked about, as I have talked about it, as a deterioration of working conditions. That if you used to be a taxi driver and you now work for Uber, you have worse terms and conditions. If you used to be a bus driver, you now have worse terms and conditions. But the point that I made in the talk, which, I guess I'll try and re-emphasize, is that in the Global South, for many, many workers, this is not a deterioration of working conditions, but is a movement, as you say, from the informal sector into a more formalized kind of work. So particularly in India, many people who may not have had formal employment before, who now start getting a paycheck of sorts from Uber, is a formalization of some of these relationships. In South Africa, lots of migrant workers are able to work for Uber in South Africa, but not work for other kinds of employment. So it gives access to a more stable form of employment. But I think the reality is we have a leveling down in the Global North and a leveling up in part in the Global South, which results in very, very similar kinds of conditions. I do think it's interesting what you say about the uniform and the kind of identification. And I actually think this is, I'm kind of fascinated by this, because Uber, for example, has pushed so hard, yes, leveling sideways, that would be a better way to put it, I think. That Uber has pushed an identity so hard of the self-employed Uber driver that is their own boss, that can do their own thing, that in a sense has created a kind of subjectivity for drivers that means drivers have lots in common with each other, that they come together around this sense of being an Uber driver, and it doesn't reflect the reality of the work. So this becomes a kind of point of contention. So I think when workers find a sense of belonging, as you're talking about in perhaps in the example in India, I think this can be quite a dangerous thing for the platform, because they've made promises that they haven't delivered on, and I also think the uniform stuff is very useful for organizing, because you can find people across the city. The red Zomato bags are really easy to see in India, and so workers meet each other quite quickly and quite easily. So the next question, what matters is, sorry.
Is that question comments more about what is the question whether the platform have exacerbated or improved the essence relations between labor and capital? And I mean, I guess the answer is when you say that, it levels up but sideways. So inequality exists in absolute terms, but I mean, I don't want to answer your question. It's your thought.
Yeah. No. I mean, I think what's interesting about this is, has it improved things or made things worse is a kind of, I don't think either, really. I think, I still see, the contradiction between labor and capital present on these platforms as it is present in other kinds of work. I guess what I find interesting about this in a way is the broader dynamics and broader arguments around innovation that are being made. So the huge amounts of venture capital that have been poured into these companies, on a claim that now many of them, Uber has now sold off its self-driving car development arm. This for so long was talked about as the long-term strategy for Uber, that they would have self-driving cars. I think the reality is now that, these companies are having to figure out how they deal in the medium term with large workforces. I think for many people, there was a kind of claim that automation would sort these issues out. And now they have these large dispersed angry workforces that they have to try and deal with. And I think they haven't innovated on how to deal with that. Which I guess is one of the points I tried to make in the talk, is that the strategies they had for dealing with labor didn't work. You know, they thought they could isolate people. They thought they wouldn't have to communicate with them. And in fact, you know, lo and behold, workers find a way to meet each other and complain about work. This is the kind of continuing feature of work, right?
In a way, they push them to cooperate. In a way. Yes, so let's proceed with the questions, being aware of time and that we need to finish slightly in advance. So do you think ideological discourse is important to how this platform maintain their power? I mean, this struggle, but also Josephine asked, given influencers have started organizing in the UK a largely female workforce, would you class their experience of platform work as gig economy labor?
Yeah, so this is a good and thorny question, the one of influencers. I briefly did some research with Twitch streamers. When I was working as a postdoc, I managed to talk myself into the Twitch offices and do some interviews with people, which was a strange research project, but it was quite, yeah. Sorry, that's a big and loaded question. Twitch is like a live streaming platform where people play video games and other people watch people playing video games. So it's a kind of live social media platform. It's owned by Amazon, who bought it for $1 billion or some kind of astonishingly large figure.
Yeah, Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez played on Twitch this winter. And yeah,
many people watched her play. So, but there's an interesting question. Yes, many people do it. It's a cultural phenomenon, which maybe you will lose half an hour of your life after the talk by going onto Twitch. I think there's an interesting question here, and perhaps I'll leave this slightly more open. So I don't know if I believe that self-employment exists. I think, and I'll try to qualify this. So I think there are lots of kinds of work that have been pushed into self-employment or freelance work, and I don't think it has changed the relationship between labor and capital in any significant way. The Uber driver is self-employed, or the delivery rider is self-employed. You know, these are not people who own the means of production, who employ other people, who buy other people's labor power. I think, though, this becomes a bit more complicated when we think about influencers and the class position of influencers. Is in a sense, and I have a friend who used to be involved in a German trade union that was supporting YouTube content creators to organize. And a lot of this was about having more control over the platform. So in a sense, some of these issues sound like the issues of Uber drivers. That, you know, if there are changes to the algorithm, these should be negotiated with the people that make content on them. But that ultimately, influencers are much more like somebody running their own business than somebody who is selling their labor power. But what I would say is I would still support influencers or YouTube content creators having more power over the platforms that they participate in. There's a huge centralization of power through platforms. If you think about Twitter, for example, becoming the arbiter of, you know, what's allowed on the platform and what's not, there should be genuine democratic control over these platforms. So influencers should have a say in how Instagram is run. You know, not just the large companies behind it. But I think there are important differences with the Brazilian migrant delivery rider who's delivering pizzas and somebody who is helping to sell advertising on Instagram, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you. So we have Nishan, more of a comment than a question, I guess, is during the COVID lockdown, delivery workers, when they used to deliver essential to my residents, they had a sense of doing a great duty, like essential workers style, but almost pride at helping me out. Great, yeah. And Alan, following up on Nicola's leveling sideways point, can it generally be said that gig economy platforms benefit a lot of small businesses, enabling them to compete more effectively with larger rivals by hiring in a low-cost service while worsening the condition of marginalized workers who provide that service? So Theo, follow up, but it's not the case that people own some of the means of production, their bikes, their cars, but the relationship which organize what they have been remain the same or worse than. And can I stick my two small questions? So, I mean, very quick. I mean, I know that they can open up a Pandora vase, but I don't want. Is there any examples of virtual co-ops coming up from these or like forms of resistance? Because I mean, it's all about, I mean, the software and the technology and the algorithm that organize this labor. And if this model is so successful, is it successful because it's in a capitalist mode of production, or is it successful because it's potentially useful also in a co-op form? And also another question is about regulations, because we saw that some governments, especially, I mean, Germany, in Italy, we had some pushback, for instance, in the Uber case. Is there any way that we can, like, you know, also internationally regulate, although there are some obvious gaps, to kind of create forms of virtuous, you know, precautionary regulator forms?
Yeah, so yeah, I think this is a great set of final questions to end on. So I'm going to start with the means of production one, because I had a student, Callum, who's written this fantastic book on Deliveroo, and I think he's dealt with this really, really well. He said he used to meet lots of people who would say, I basically own the means of production as a delivery rider. And he was a delivery rider for some time. And I think there's a risk in us saying that the bicycle is the means of production, and that somehow this has changed the relationships between labor and capital. I think really what we're looking at here is like when the cleaner has to bring a bottle of chemicals themselves, or the chef brings their own knife to work, or the carpenter brings their own tools, they're not profiting off the exploitation of their own labor, but they're being forced to buy things in order to work. So the bicycle is not capital. The bicycle is part of the means of subsistence. And I think the problem is, if we talk about it as the means of production, we let these large platforms off the hook. And we say anyone with an app can do this. There is huge amounts of advertising, and I'm more skeptical about algorithmic management, but there's some algorithmic management that's used to do all these things. Massive banks of servers that are causing greenhouse gas emissions that we never talk about with platform work. The servers of Deliveroo, the carbon footprint of these things. I think we need to kind of try and understand those broader relationships, and unpick what's happening there. And I think part of this is also an answer to your question, Lorena, I think I'm very skeptical of co-ops. I mean, maybe I've given a sense of my theoretical background already, but my belief is that I'm very skeptical of co-ops in the here and now, because I want everything to be cooperative. And I think co-ops can be an interesting intervention, and they can be exciting, and they can show us how we do things differently. But if you try to set up a co-op version of Uber in London, Uber will crush it.
Yeah.
Which I'm sure you agree with, right? But it's become very vogue.
Teachers, all of us, hundreds of years ago.
But it's become a vogue, right? To say if only we had a co-op version of the platform, everything would be fine. And I think there are some exciting examples. So where Uber is banned, it's possible for an effective co-op to be set up. So there are a couple of places in the US that have done this. but they're only able to do it when there isn't the pressure of capitalist competition. And so I think, the question here is, and again, Callum has a fantastic argument for this, is instead of arguing for these platforms to become co-ops, why don't we talk about nationalizing them? So for example, if you nationalized Uber in the UK and you integrated it with public transport, so I wouldn't mind paying for my Ubers and paying enough that the driver was paid fairly, and even paying an extra so that buses were cross-subsidized. And you could have a properly integrated public transport system that also includes taxis. Now, it also allows those drivers to organize against the state for higher wages. So you can still have ways to include workers' rights inside of that. But part of this is saying that there isn't just a kind of technical way to deal with these things. Is nationalization for me would mean seizing Uber's actual means of production, and saying that it's workers that built that, and so workers should have control over it. And so it's a question of power, right? Which, yes, people have taught us over hundreds of years that work is a question of power, and I think that's still the question here, right? And I think perhaps in a roundabout way that also answers Alan's question of, yes, hiring low-paid workers can give you competitive advantage over other companies. People find ways to reduce costs, and a lot of platforms is about outsourcing. This is about internally outsourcing labor power to reduce costs to compete with people. And I think what we're beginning to see is, the end to that model being seen as a natural or kind of positive thing to happen.
Yeah, great. Yeah, I mean, very nice discussion, because we ended up with a lot of open questions, and for the future, and now it's gonna be shaped by power relations. Great, thank you very much, Jamie. That was really, really nice, and I hope you enjoyed the discussion, and I hope we didn't bore you with very journalistic, but this is the beauty of these seminars, because it's a really interdisciplinary, comes from different disciplines and different perspectives. So thank you very much, Jamie. Thank you, everybody. And Nicola, everybody actually congratulates you. We really hope that we will be able to do a face-to-face thing. So we are an active research cluster working on different issues, innovation, workers, so the IGD. And let's see if we can organize a OU workshop sometimes. We also have a London-based office that will probably be open at some point. So, okay. Thank you, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon, and good luck with all the projects. Bye.
Brilliant. Thanks, everyone. Thank you.